Got it.
Lovely, lovely. So I am here today with David Votter, who is currently the president of ALA. Thank you for joining me today, David.
Thank you for
So
having me.
today we are going to be talking about subletting and permitted occupiers. So as we all know, subletting is quite common in the private rented sector, whether people are doing it with permission or whether they're doing it without. So we're going to be looking today at the legalities of it, and also what you can do if you need to get rid of a permitted occupier. So we'll start with looking at permitted occupiers. So from your perspective, David, both as an ALA president and as a letting agent yourself, when would you look at having a permitted occupier in a property, and who would those permitted occupiers be?
I mean, I'd have to be careful. I mean, I wouldn't say anything on the basis of a voice from Arla, but what I would do is talk as a letting agent. So what I would do, I would tend to stay away from permitted occupiers, only because in my experience as a letting agent, if you imagine you've got a situation where you've got a named tenant, which is Julie, and then you've got permitted occupier, which is David, comes in, Julie decides that she wants to move, and then you're left with permitted occupier David, who is named on the agreement as a permitted occupier. But legally, how does that stand in a court of law? How does one get that permitted occupier out? What rights do they have? Do they assume the rights of a tenant? Do they act as a licensee? And it's one of those grey areas that, well, it's not so much of a grey area, but when it comes to serving notices, getting the possession of the property back, it can be quite a complex thing. So I would rather steer clear of permitted occupiers and have someone named on the tenancy. I mean, the real question here, Julie, is why would you? Why would you want to be a permitted occupier? And what I've seen in the past as a practicing letting agent is, in some cases, you've had Julie and David. Julie's got impeccable credit. David's got dreadful credit. He's got £3,000 CCJ. But the landlord might indemnify and say, on the basis of Julie's affordability and the rest of David's good references, we could put it together and they'll make a commercial decision. But things like that, you've got to apply the risk element to it. So because of David's credit rating, they no longer become insurable tenants in common, really, do they? So I don't like it. I'm sorry, I don't like it, Julie. You can say something different. Go on, go.
No, absolutely. I don't disagree. I'm a bit like GB News here. We can have disagreements, but no one will get cancelled. I am a little bit opposite to that. I would welcome a permitted occupier onto a tenancy agreement. I absolutely agree with what you are saying with regards to the risk element of having somebody in there who doesn't really have much weight. But at the same time, if you've got somebody on a tenancy agreement as a tenant, but they aren't actually able to pay the rent because they maybe don't have an income. You see a lot of that sometimes with people that have taken time out to look after children. They don't have a job. They then have all the rights and responsibilities of a tenant without actually being able to fulfill them. So that's why I prefer to have people on as permitted occupiers. But at the same time, I think it needs to be managed really well. And I think the tenancy agreement has to be worded in a way that really specifies that if the tenant is given notice, that permitted occupier is going with them. They don't get to stay. But I do absolutely take on board what you're saying of why you would steer clear of them, because it's the protection of your landlord as well, because you want to make sure that when you're serving notice and you're evicting, everybody's going. So if everybody's on the tenancy agreement as a tenant, legally, once that section 21 is served, everybody's going with them. I absolutely get that completely. So on that subject, what rights do permitted occupiers have when it comes to remaining in the property if the main tenant vacates?
Well, this is the tricky area, isn't it? I mean, we have actually got a permitted occupier clause that we put into the agreement. So we note the main tenant, which again, I use me and you. Julie is the main tenant and David as the permitted occupier. But then we put a specifically and carefully worded clause within the tenancy agreement that goes with what you say in relation to the rights. I mean, the responsibilities fall solely on the tenant, but, the conduct of the permitted occupier reflects that of the tenant under tenant-like manner. The rules and obligations set out in the tenancy agreement still apply to the permitted occupier. They can't contract out of that. So it's how you set it up and how you frame it up. I mean, it's worked for me a few times over the years. And then I've heard of other cases, not specifically my own, where I've spoke to other agents, other landlords, where it's fallen flat on its face and they've really not known what to do. And how does it work with repayments of deposit? Well, that goes to the original tenant. So you've got to know what you're doing, because I mean, like you, Julie, I speak to a lot of landlords that are self-managing still, fumbling their way in their dark. And I look at their contracts and they're not worth the paper they're written on. And they've got bits in there that don't apply. They've got stuff that where they say they can charge a tenant where it's unlawful under the Tenant Fees Act. And it's kind of, it's painful. And I feel really obligated to help these people. And that's when I sweep in and go, right, let's give it an overhaul. So yes, that's my roundabout political answer to your question.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, we've all had those scenarios where we've got the permitted occupier in there, as agreed, everything was running smoothly for the last 3 years. It's lovely. Then there is either a breakdown in relationship or maybe something more extreme. The tenant is arrested, put into prison, and you're left with the permitted occupier in the property. So what do we do then? Because obviously with the tenant no longer in occupation, if the permitted occupier doesn't leave, where does that leave our landlords? Because they can't just walk in and change the locks. We know they can't just change the locks.
No.
So what would be their next steps to get rid of that tenant, that occupant?
I would always default, get specialist legal advice, you know, with your agreement and what have you got in place. Hopefully, if you are managing yourself, then you can take your agreement that you've had done by the agent or whoever to your solicitor and get the next step. Or if you've got the managing agent, you ask advice of the agent if they're a voluntarily accredited agent, which, let's face it, Julie, not everybody is. You know, we're in an unregulated industry here. So it's about getting the right advice from that step onwards, because you could make the wrong step. You know, you could basically go and say, well, actually, they got no legal rights. I've looked up on Google. I've looked in the landlord forum, you know, Landlords UK, and 7 different landlords says, that's your property. You can take possession. And then they end up in court. So the reality is you need the expert advice. You can't just change the locks. There's a notice period. There's a period that you've got to adhere to. And if you're unclear, just get the legal advice on it. You pay an expert to take that off you. Yeah, it might cost a few £100, but it's better than costing a few £1,000. That's the best thing that I could say, because I find with, and I know it's going to sound very wrong in some cases, but depends on which judge you're going to get in court. It depends which way the wind's blowing, which way the sun's shining, whether the petals are out on the plants and all sorts of stuff as to whether you'll get possession. And this is where a solicitor will go belt and braces and go, actually, no, we need to reserve this. I mean, I've served Section 21s before that have been very compliant and fine, but a solicitor's then gone, actually, no, we want to do our own and change it. We've gone the original one and got possession, but there's a reason why they are very meticulous, these solicitors, because they've seen the outcome. They go to court. It's what they do for a living. You know, I've been to court a few times to help clients out, and fortunately, none of my own customers, just ones that I've consulted on. And it's been eye-opening. It really is, just to see how the court process works, how the advocates are there representing the client, and how if you've got even a technicality on your agreement, sorry, back out, reapply to court. Another, God knows how long to get back. So
yeah, and I think what you're saying there as well about people who are self-managing, or even I've experienced it from some agents with lesser experience, they're using Google and social media as their forms of legal advice, and I genuinely cannot stress how dangerous that is, because just because somebody who's been doing it 30 years tells you on Facebook this is the right way to do it doesn't mean they're doing it right. You know, it's a case of, if somebody's driving around without car insurance, just because they're telling you they've got away with it for the last 30 years, don't make it right.
No, exactly.
You know,
they've been very lucky.
Well, yeah, exactly. They've been lucky. And I think that's part of the problem. Social media is really taken over as the governing body almost of legal entity of advice.
In anything.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen it myself on social media where you literally read the comments that other landlords or whoever they may be have put on there, and you're just like, please just don't.
That
just step away from the comments. There's nothing to see. But I mean, I've got a situation at the moment where I'm working with a client where they've rented out their property, they're self-managing. The tenant has now gone into prison and he's going to be there for quite considerable time. And the girlfriend is a permitted occupier. What can they do? She's basically dug her heels in and said, I'm not leaving, I've got rights. She hasn't, but okay. And she ultimately wants a council house. That's her aim. So my landlords are kind of like, what do we do? Because at the end of the day, they want their property back. This tenant's not coming back for some considerable time because of what he's done. where do they stand? And like you, I've said they need really clear legal advice. I can advise them to a point, but I'm not a lawyer. But the way that we're looking at it is we're kind of going around the houses a little bit, and we're actually going directly to the tenant in prison.
Yeah.
And we're asking the tenant if he'll surrender, because if he surrenders the property, the girlfriend's got to go.
Well, she's not going to do lightly, is he? Let's face it.
Well, we don't know. Maybe they're not, maybe she's not happy he's gone into prison. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you could go anywhere with it. Would the tenant assume responsibility? Would the permitted occupier, the girlfriend, assume responsibility of that tenancy as a lawful tenant? Be reference to that fact if she got the affordability. Would you serve a Section 8, Ground 7A under antisocial behaviour because he's been convicted of a crime? Then you could give the notice period that's aligned with that. But then where do you serve it? It'll be last known residence, which will be, I hate to say it, cell block H or wherever it might be. And then you've got a notification to give to the the permitted occupiers. Well, it's a mess. It's an absolute mess. And that landlord should not suffer that loss of rent for that period of time. The landlord's already struggling in relation to mortgage interest relief. A tenant does a runner, they don't get their money back. It's not, the law needs a real reform. And when they called it the Renters Reform Bill, which is now the Fairer Rented Private Sector, they've amended it so it's not so one-sided. These are the things they really need to look at, because a tenant will always feel landlord has the law in the palm of their hands, and vice versa. And to be honest with you, Julie, it's not fit for purpose for either of them, really. But you look at it, the tenant can manipulate the system very easily. So could a rogue landlord. If you imagine a tenant wants to get a risk assessment done from the local authority with an improvement order, what's the process for that? I mean, they're understaffed, they're overwhelmed, these authorities, and it's just, the system is broken. It needs a real reform. And I hope that the suggestions they bring in the reform, there's a lot of good ones, there's a lot of negative ones that will have a catastrophic impact. I mean, well, I use the Tenant Fees Act a lot. People will say, David, stop talking about the Tenant Fees Act, because we had to stop charging tenant fees because some agents were going crazy with it, right? Instead of capping it. Now, we said, if you do this, government, if you do that, then every landlord is going to suffer financially and they will up the rent. And then also anybody with a pet, because you're capping deposits, they'll get overlooked, and I predicted so many things on this mind map that I created the morning it came out, and because I was really angry. And then I've revisited that in the last year, and I've ticked off about 98% of those things, because we do it, don't we? We know what the outcome is. But it's just trying to convince the powers that be. So yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem, isn't it? Because we don't have people that are at the coalface of this industry that make the changes to our legislation. We have young civil servants who are straight out of university looking at nothing more than pieces of paper, maybe a few bits of case law. They're not actually seeing how it works in practice and the general knock-on effect and impact it will have to landlords and tenants. And I think that's what's frustrating about both the Tenant Fee Ban Act and the Renters Reform Bill, or whatever they're calling it now. I don't know. It'll have a new name by the time it comes out. It
probably will if it comes out.
It is frustrating, but like you say, they haven't addressed all the things that really needed to be addressed in this industry. And I think one of those, I know we're currently waiting for the Supreme Court to make a decision on that rent-to-rent case and the superior landlord and all this. And that kind of brings me on to the subletting side of things, because while we've got so much law, I mean, as well as I do, we've got 169 laws and 402 pieces of legislation and a few bits more coming along. But some of those are so antiquated. I mean, I still can't believe that on a daily basis I'm dealing with the Distress for Rent Act 1737. Do you know what I mean? It's
Section
like
18.
Why am I dealing with this?
Do you get many of those?
Yeah.
Isn't it outrageous? That piece of legislation is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. But it's also surprising how many people don't know about it. I spoke to a few solicitors that had never heard of it.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, it's been around a while.
Just a few centuries, yeah.
But I encourage landlords to actually put it in their acknowledgement of notice to quits. So as soon as the tenants put their notice in, I encourage landlords to put that in the response.
Please be mindful that you could be charged double the rent for each day you reside after your notice period ends. Exactly. It's exactly what it needs to be done, because it is, and it's It could, you know, and it's not greed, it's about the inconvenience of it all. You imagine you've got another tenant lined up that's got removals in the house, and they've got tenant, and then chains of chains of chains, and it's kind of like, it's very tricky, but it's one of those things that have to be managed carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously this Supreme Court case, Jepson and is it Ranksome? I think that's right. Should have written it down, which is basically a court case about who a superior landlord is, and when a rent repayment order is due because there was no license on a property, who is liable. So at the moment, the way the law reads in the Housing and Planning Act, it's the superior landlord. The superior landlord to most people would be the property owner, because the kind of buck stops with them. But as we know, there's a lot of people out there now doing rent to rent, and rent to rent operators kind of step in and become almost like a quasi landlord. Yeah. So they are direct landlord to the tenants in the property. So they're a landlord, but then everything that seems to go wrong would then fall on the superior landlord who had nothing to do with anything. So this is what this Supreme Court case is about, if who really is responsible. Now, with rent to rent operators, we know that basically what they're doing is subletting. They rent the property from the landlord for a set period of time, let's say 3 to 5 years, for a guaranteed rent. Then they go out and they find the tenants, they put them in there on ASTs, and they rent the property out and skim off the top. It's not a new strategy. I know a lot of people think rent to rent is this brand new idea. It's been happening like that for a long, long time. Northwood were probably one of the largest organizations doing the rent to rent model. They called it guaranteed rent, and they did it really well because it was done professionally and they ran it as a business. Sometimes rent to rent operators feel that this is an easy way to get into the property business, that it's not that hard. There's not a lot of legislation that has to attack them. Unlike agents, they don't have to be regulated. They don't have to be part of a redress scheme. They don't have to have client money protection and all the other bits that go with it. But it can still go horribly wrong.
Yeah.
And when it goes horribly wrong, this is where we have the subletting issue. So most landlords that have tenants on ASTs directly from the property owner to the tenant will have a clause in there that says no subletting.
No subletting, absolutely.
Unless, you know, you ask nicely and the landlord says you can do it. But from my perspective, the subletting isn't just about whether you're going to have more people in the property than is on the tenancy agreement. It's the wider impact. So a lot of people don't realise that sometimes their mortgage that restricts subletting.
Absolutely prohibits it.
Their insurance may restrict who they can sublet to, or if they can even sublet. And also if it's a flat, exactly, a lease. So you could have a lease that won't allow it. But a lot of people don't look at that. So from a subletting point of view, the first question I have for you is subletting legal or illegal?
Oh, for God's sake, can I answer that? I think yes, it is legal if it's done correctly, like you said, with the Northwood models. And I've consulted for this chap in London who went through this company, which I won't name, and they got to a tenant and the tenant hadn't paid rent, but then they also say they guarantee the rent, but then they didn't guarantee the rent because the rent hadn't come in. And then they said, okay, oh, no, sorry, the rent continued to come in. It was late, but then they sorted it out. It was serving notice. So he was serving notice to the company, but then he's like, do I serve notice to the tenant? Because it's my property. I need to financially sell it. So he was trying to get possession back of the property. But in their literature, it says we serve notice on behalf of you to the tenant, because they're almost like a licensee. So the tenant is the company, say, for example, you know, the company you mentioned. And then the under tenant who actually lives there is like the licensee, the occupier. So there's certain notices that are served in a different way. It's interesting because I've got a situation where we let to a company and they let to tenants at a financial hardship, and it's a non-housing act tenancy. So you bring it, you know, and as you know, non-housing act tenancies come to an end under effluxion of time unless agreement has been made, and this particular one is rolling on and on. But then in order to bring it to officially to an end, you do the notice to quit as well, and it's certain things are specifically worded. So it is legal if it's done correctly, in my eyes, in my personal eyes. But in other ways, you can't do it. Like, say, for example, you've got a guy that rents a 4-bedroom house, and then he starts renting out 3 of the other rooms, or a 5-bedroom house and he rents 4 of the other rooms. He could, consequently create himself a HMO for the landlord, and then the landlord falls under those regulations and fire doors and fire escapes and risk assessments and all of those bits and pieces. So again, it's another thing that you've got to be very mindful of. I mean, I went to see a lady this morning with a house up for sale. Ultimately, she wants to sell it, but she came to me and said, look, could we rent it? And it would fetch a good rent. But it's a big 6-bedroom house. It used to be flats. She converted it into a house, lived there. The rooms are like a studio apartment in itself.
Yeah.
And then she's worried that what if I get someone in, they sublet the rooms? And this is where your routine inspections come in and all those bits. Because we had a situation about 8 years ago where we had, this was before they changed the regulations and the story rule, and we had, I think it's about 3 guys in somewhere, and then they added a 4th guy in as well, and it was like 3 different households, and they inadvertently created a HMO. This was brought to attention by a neighbour. As soon as we got that information, as the agent, we immediately said, right, okay, that's a miss. We need to get in there. We got our inspection done quicker. Turns out there was another chap living there. We served notice. The parents who were guarantors were kicking off because they said, you're unlawfully evicting my son. Well, actually, they've created an illegal tenancy. So you just can't take your eye on the ball, because in this world, there's always someone that's going to try and catch you out at some point. Sounds horrible, but it is the way it is. The law's there's so many rules and regulations in place. If you get caught doing something, it could be disastrous. But then there's people that walk the tightrope for years and get away with flipping murder, and it's really frustrating.
No, I absolutely agree with that. And what doesn't help is you do have some agents out there that seem to think that it is their God-given right to get round these regulations.
Don't try.
I am talking to a letting agent at the moment who, every time he contacts me, I know it's because he's trying to find a loophole or a grey area. And exactly that with the HMO legislation. His question is, if I say that they're all cousins, it's not an HMO, right? Because technically they're related. Yeah. So yeah, and you have that as well, especially if people are from, certain ethnicities and surnames are similar and things like that. How can you prove they're not related?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, you have to get passports, you have to do what's it, the family tree and stuff like that. It's hard, and it's you get a lot out when you do your referencing, but then when you've got the referencing, tenants have passed, then you go, who is the lawful tenant here? But fascinating.
Yeah. So with the rent to rent thing still in mind, if we've got a rent to rent operator who decides actually rent to rent isn't for him or her, and they just decide to shut their rent to rent business down, and you're left, Mr. Landlord, with this void of a rent to rent operator, but their tenant's still in your property. What can you do?
Well, this is it. It's understanding what the situation is, because then with that rent to rent operator closing down, does the tenant automatically, the licensee automatically become a tenant? And does the agreement default back to the assured short hold tenancy agreement again? That is the $1 million question, isn't it? So when you've got a rent to rent scheme and the middle ground, the rent to rent company are gone, where does that leave the landlord? And now I know you just asked me that question, I just asked you it back, but that is the thing, isn't it? Where does it leave the landlord? Have you then got a lawful tenant you have to serve notice on? And again, you just got to get to a solicitor and go, this is the situation I'm faced with. What on earth do I do now? And because, like you say, there's no redress. They can shut up shop, client money protection, they might run off with deposit. It's just, it needs, there's got to be some kind of regulation in place for that rent to rent side of things, I believe. I mean, I've been quite ignorant to this current court case. I've been so caught up with everything else that I haven't really followed it very well. So it just opens up too many questions. And for me, as a letting agent, personally, it's my personal opinion, I would kind of avoid situations like that in case, unless I've got an absolute fail safe, like an insurance place that would kick in. It's just a headache. It's just a real headache. And I'm always the rule of KISS, keep it simple, stupid,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the key, isn't it? I mean, I hear a lot of rent to rent operators that come onto the circuit and they're talking about they've been on this training course. And as soon as I hear those words, I'm just like, oh dear, really? A training course? My heart sinks and I'm just like, what's going to come out of their mouth next? And then you hear, oh, do you know any letting agents you can put me in touch with, because I've got to find my properties from letting agents? And I'm like, I don't get it. Maybe it's just that I'm old and maybe I just don't get it. But why would you go to a letting agent to find a property that is owned by somebody else? Because I can't see what role the letting agent would have in a rent to rent operating system. Because my understanding is you'd rent it directly from the landlord, you giving the landlord a hands off guaranteed rent every month while you manage the property as the rent to rent operator. What's the letting agent going to do?
I think they're probably, yeah, exactly. Unless they've got to find the individuals maybe to draw up the contract, but then surely the rent to rent operator would have their own contract. But
You'd
then,
think.
what you have, Julie, is a situation where that landlord's got the rent to rent operator's contract. You've got to get that in front of your solicitor because there could be clauses in there to catch you out specifically. And again, I'm not saying that rent to rent operators are rogue. And like you said, there's
No.
companies that do it very well, but it's the reason why we're talking about this is when it goes wrong, and this is it. That's like me saying every tenant's bad, every landlord's bad. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is what to look out for, spot the troublesome bits, and how to deal with it when it does go belly up.
No, absolutely. And this isn't about, bashing rent to rent operators by any stretch of the imagination, because property is one of those areas where it is so diverse, and a bit like the music industry, there's room for everybody doing it at every level.
Absolutely.
So rent to rent done right, I think, is a really good model for both landlord and the rent to rent operator. It's a great platform to get onto the property ladder and get your foot in the water. But I do think rent to rent, from my opinion, should only be done for a maximum maybe 4 or 5 years. Get your cash flow, and then you need to start buying your own property and getting rid of the rent to rent. I don't think it should be a permanent business model, because I don't think it's sustainable. But at the same time, getting it right is so important, because I see so many people coming into rent to rent and they want to put themselves on an AST with the landlord. And the amount of times I have to explain that you don't live in the property, you can't be a tenant.
No, you haven't got exclusive
It's
possession.
A business to business situation.
Exactly.
And the penny doesn't seem to drop.
No.
And then the landlord's protecting their deposit, and I'm like, you shouldn't even be paying a deposit. There's a lot of things that just aren't understood, and I think that's part of the problem. Landlords think this sounds really good, someone's going to pay me the rent every month, I don't have to worry about relet fees, voids, all this, that and the other. It's hands off, I've had enough. And then you've actually got someone who's not really too sure what it is that they're doing. I see it all the time where the contracts are wrong, and like you said, you've got to get a contract in front of a solicitor, but how many people actually want to pay to do that?
No.
They'd rather sign on the dotted line because they like somebody.
Yeah.
And then should it all go horribly wrong, now they've got to throw more money at a solicitor to try and undo the mess.
Yeah, which is
I don't
even worse
understand
and more costly.
why people won't want to get their contracts checked first before giving their biggest asset to somebody that they hardly know.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier. I think it's because, it's hands off, it's cheaper, and then when you've got to go and get a solicitor check over, then you're paying out again. And it's kind of, as a landlord, you want to get as much return as you can and pay out as little as possible. But when it comes to something as vitally important as a contract, law of property contract, you've got to get it done. You've got to get it done properly. And I hear stuff from people. Yeah, I did an assured short tenancy for 4 years. Well, actually, you can't do more than 3 years because it has to be executed as a deed.
Yes.
Worded in a similar fashion, but it's invalid otherwise. And it's kind of like getting that concept right and notice periods and all that. So, isn't it fascinating, the world we live in?
It certainly is. And I think when you start getting into that territory of the length of an AST, again, Google is not your friend in this situation, because I see if you put into Google how long should an AST be. Now, we all know...
Doesn't give you the answer. Doesn't give you the answer.
No, it doesn't. Now, we all know there's no minimum term, so an AST could technically be for a day.
Yeah.
But the issue there is you can't actually serve notice until 4 months have gone. Exactly. That's a 2-month notice. So actually you've got a 6-month tenancy, but it could have been written for just 1 day.
Yeah.
But like you say, if you want a fixed term because the tenant and landlord want security, I've seen a 7-year AST and I was like, oh, that's cute. It's pointless, but it's cute. And I've had to inform the landlord that now you've put 7 years on there, your tenant is now liable for stamp duty, land tax.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you aware of that, Mr. Landlord? Yeah. Oh, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. 1 year at a time. 1 year at a time. Renew it every time. It's fine. Keep renewing. But stop doing these long-term tenancies. They're dangerous.
Yeah. Isn't it funny, the old stamp duty land tax where the tenant is still liable to pay? How many tenants out there know that?
Exactly. They don't.
Yeah.
They don't. And it is interesting because the property I lived in before I moved here, I was in there for 12 years, but it was a periodic for that entire time.
Yeah.
So technically, because of the amount of rent I'd paid over that period, I should have been paying stamp duty land tax on that property. I didn't. No one chased me. No one knew. Don't come after me now, HMRC.
Is this going live, this recording?
But it's a lot of people aren't aware of it, landlords, tenants, and agents as well, interestingly. But I think that's the problem, is it's education, and education costs money.
It does. And the way I look at it, I mean, there's a lot of us that are accredited. We value the accreditation. We love going to these seminars and conferences and hearing legal speakers and hearing trading standards, and we love all that because that's that enhances our business. So we go away and we go, right, I heard that today, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, stuff like that. I'm pretty up to speed with a lot of it, but I heard a talk from trading standards yesterday and I went back and thought, are we doing that? And it's made me second guess it. I think, should we just tweak that and tweak that and tweak that? Not that I'm in breach of anything currently, but it gets your mind thinking how something that's written a certain way, things like, we don't do it, but there's still some agents doing price on application. You're not allowed to do that anymore.
No.
Not over here. But, I think the portals have closed that option down now. But even things like service charge, ground rent, council tax, all that stuff, it should... I don't think the portal should allow a property onto the market till it's got that. Whereas some cases you look at it and it says ask agent, and I think, come on, that's rubbish.
Yeah, I think you're right. The portals could manage it an awful lot better. They could police it because they have the power to. All they need is one of their IT guys in the back end to just make all of these boxes mandatory. You can't move on to the next thing until you've filled in this box.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's all they need to do.
Yeah, and I've had it with softwares I've used in the past where it comes back, it's a data feed error, could not upload your property to the portal. It's easily done, But anyway, I think we're deviating from our subletting conversation, aren't we?
No, absolutely. So going back to subletting.
Yes.
So if we've got a tenant that's subletting or a rent-to-rent operator that's subletting and they disappear, so your main person has gone and you're left with your subletter. Now, from a legal perspective, as long as the landlord doesn't collect rent from that occupant, they are not the landlord's direct tenant, because it's obviously payment and acceptance of rent that creates
a lawfully binding agreement. Yeah,
absolutely. So if the landlord doesn't accept rent from this occupant, what is the landlord going to do to evict this person? Because they have never been their direct landlord. They're not accepting rent from them, so they're not a tenant. They're not a squatter. They're not there illegally.
No, squatters' rights got abolished.
Yeah. What was that, 2016?
14, I think. Anti-Social Crime and Policing Act. One of those.
Blimey.
Don't quote me on it.
I'm quoting you on that.
Just a rough one. Can you tell me later? Can you check Google and find out if that's true?
Absolutely. So what do we do to get rid of this person? Or what if we really like them and don't want to get rid of them?
Well, if you like them and you don't want to get rid of them, then you approach them directly, reference them, and just say, look, do you meet the affordability criteria? Can you fulfill the obligations of an AST? And then you do the reference off the back of that. You make sure you've got rent guarantee and legal cover when you set the tenancy up. Get it all done properly. If you don't want them, then I default to my default answer, go and get your solicitor. Every single time.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the subletting itself isn't illegal, even if someone is subletting and their tenancy says they shouldn't, all you've got there is breach of tenancy. You don't have a criminal act that has been committed. So the only thing you would be able to do is take your tenant to court for breach of contract. Now, we know that breach of contract is Section 8, Ground 12, discretionary, up to the judge on the day if he's had a nice cup of coffee or not. If the kids ate their cornflakes, if they didn't. It doesn't, you
don't take the chance. You never go to court on a discretionary ground unless you've got mandatory. So then what would you do? Would you rely on, your Section 21? But if we're in post-renters reform life, there'll be no Section 21. So this is why the government need a robust system in place to allow a landlord to get tenancy back. I mean, where else, Julie, can you have a contract with someone, they breach it, and you go, don't worry, Julie, it's all right, it's fine. Nothing's going to happen. It's fine.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen. So what is the purpose of the contract if you can't enact the breaches? you know.
And also going back to the Section 21, well, a Section 21 wouldn't even be valid in this situation because you, as the person wanting possession, couldn't prove that you've served
How to rent guy, yeah, exactly,
and all of
yeah.
that. You couldn't prove you've served those, so you're
No,
automatically on a back foot because your Section 21, I
it's
would
not
say, would be
existent.
invalid.
Yeah, because it's not. It wasn't intended. That's the thing. The intention to be an AST. It was
Exactly.
intended to be a non-housing act agreement or a license or whatever it was. So Section 21 would be invalid. So what would you do? Notice to quit? Get a solicitor.
Get a solicitor. Absolutely. So have you ever had any, horror stories when it comes to subletting or anything like that, or even permitted occupiers in your history as an agent?
I haven't really, because I've kind of stayed away from them. We've had situations where we've had rented to companies, got possession back quite easily and lawfully and all that. I can't think of any situations that I've personally had. I hear like this one I spoke to recently. He couldn't get possession of the property back because he thought they were serving the Section 21. Then the tenants are saying they're not going. They're getting housed by the council. So he's got a tenant sitting there at the moment. The rent's coming in, but financially he is desperate to sell that property and he can't. He can't get it sold. So other than that, I don't have any real horror stories on that. What about you?
Yeah, sadly, I think it must just have been where I've been working over the years. Most of my career started in London, Hackney and that area. So you can imagine it's not the nicest of area, or it wasn't at the time. I think it's much more gentrified now. And I started my job as a property manager, and I was going out to my property inspection. We knew that the tenant had moved out and left her partner in the property. We knew that was fine. The landlord was happy. The rent was still being paid. I was just going around to do an ordinary inspection. No problem there. So I turned up to this property and it looked a bit grubby. You're kind of like, yeah, single bloke living there. It really did look like that. But unfortunately, on going into the property, it was a little bit more than just he wasn't very good at cleaning. He was actually using one of the back bedrooms, which was covered from floor to ceiling in black tarpaulin, literally from floor to ceiling. So as you opened the door, there was kind of like this funny sort of black bag crunching as you opened the door. And I was like, this ain't normal. So got me I always had a torch, but back before you had phones that had torches on it, I actually carried
an actual torch. It's probably about that big.
Yeah, that's the one. Also used as a weapon if needed.
Yeah, exactly. Self-defense.
Got me torch, and it was literally just black tarpaulin all around this room. I'm like, what on earth is going on here? And then in the corner of the room, there was this tripod with a camera on it, and I thought, oh, that's a bit weird.
Hello.
So anyway, I rang the police because I thought this is not normal behaviour. And it turned out that he was actually using that back bedroom to record snuff movies, and the camera still had the media card in it from the last movie that he'd recorded, where unfortunately the tenant that claimed she had moved out had actually been murdered.
Oh,
it was all on video.
Oh my God. That is outrageous.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that was my introduction to property inspections.
So that is a breach of tenancy because they're using it for business purposes as well, aren't they? God, that is awful.
Yeah.
It's funny, actually, when you asked me, you've just made me think of one. It's about a year ago we had one, and it's only a little one-bedroom place. And we took over management of it from another agent. So I go in there with a pre-approved, and I got this lady from Eastern Europe or wherever it was, and then this English chappie as well. And we were chatting, and there was a bed as you go up to the back door. You go in, there's a bed in the kitchen area, which is weird. And the bedroom's at the back there with another bed. So I'm like, this is weird. And what's the relationship? He was the only one on the tenancy. I said, do you live here? She went, in her accent, yeah, sometimes. And I said, right, we need to get you either as a PO or we need to get you referenced on the agreement because at the moment we don't know who you are. And there's another bed there. So someone's obviously staying here. So they agreed to that. Really nice, made me a cup of tea, got me a packet of biscuits to take back to the team in the office, like a welcome. Really lovely. I'm thinking, I might be being bribed here slowly. So anyway, I'm sitting there and I said, because you know what I'm like, I just wear my heart on my sleeve. And what's the deal with the bed? Do you like to roll out of bed and make a quick cup of tea in the morning? Is it quicker to get to the kitchen? I mean, it's not that far. And they said, oh, no, because he works nights in transport, he doesn't like to come in and wake her up. So we'll come in through the door quietly. She's got the door shut and he'll go straight to sleep. I was like, seems legit, seems
Logical.
like it's genuine. Yeah. Anyway, we get this, we reference her, get on the agreement. That's all good. That's all fine. The rent still comes in. They keep it immaculate, very nice and all that. And then I get this message from the client who is skiing away. And I said, David, the neighbour's been in touch, and they keep seeing comings and goings at the property, and it's a bit bizarre. Like people coming in, guys coming in, going out, and I'm thinking, right, okay, we need to start looking into this a bit deeper. And then he sent me a link to a website where that address is being listed as a brothel. So I was actually in a meeting with a couple of solicitors, and I thought, right, I've got to tread very carefully here. And I was chatting to them. I said, look, whilst I've got you as solicitors, what would you advise here? Because I'm in a bit of a quandary, because part of me just wants to ring them up. And so I rang them up, and I got this, hello, darling. And I was like, hello, yes, I'd like to arrange an appointment. Okay, but because I called from a withheld number, you need to make your number known to me, okay? So call me back. I was like, right, she's not going to deal with me all the time on withheld. I'm not giving out my mobile number. Crikey, imagine that getting out there. So one of the solicitors, both female, they were brilliant. They said, I'll call them, I don't care. So she called from her mobile and booked in. And they were only operating at that address on Fridays. And and it turns out it was. I mean, we never found any evidence. The police were surveying, we never found any true hard evidence like you did. But we brought that tenancy to an end anyway, and they went quietly.
Yeah.
That could have gone horribly wrong, a bit like your situation with the death. That's awful.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and especially for that was my first ever death, actually. Unfortunately, in my career, I've had 12 of them. I just don't seem to be very lucky with my tenants, unfortunately. But a lot of that was to do, I think, with the areas that I was working in. Crime was quite high in those areas, so
number of lets you're doing, number of properties you look after.
Exactly. It's all
ratio is going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. It's all relative in that respect, but it's hard, and I think sometimes when I'm speaking to letting agents and landlords, even now, when they're dealing with a death for the very first time, it is traumatic. It's very difficult to separate yourself from it, because especially if you're a self-managing landlord, that's your property, and somebody's passed away in your property, that in itself is quite traumatic. But then as an agent, to have to try and manage everybody and everyone's emotions, because obviously everyone is extremely emotional at that time, that in itself can be really hard as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's tough. It's never easy. And especially, I mean, I've had it a couple of times, and I remember her, you built that rapport with them, you really like them, and then that happens, and then you're dealing with the family, and you have to put your managing agent head aside and have that empathetic human level. You forget the professional, you become a person. You give them a hug, you take flowers, you take chocolate, you say, I'll do whatever you want. Sometimes you go to the funeral. So yeah, God, this is getting dark, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? I know. Well, maybe that is it. Rent to death. That's it.
Oh, for God's sake.
That's how it's going. Although I do think once this Supreme Court ruling comes in, whenever they're going to make their announcement on the decision, I do think it will either make or break the rent to rent market. Because if the Supreme Court decide that the rent to rent operator is the person directly responsible for the HMO license and not the superior landlord, a lot of rent to rent operators, I think, are going to come out of doing HMOs, because they're not going to want that responsibility and that liability.
It's a big responsibility, isn't it? Yeah.
But also, alternatively, if the outcome is that the superior landlord, so the property owner, is ultimately responsible, as the law currently states, I think a lot of landlords are going to steer away from going with rent to rent operators in case they don't get the HMO license. So I think it's going to have a detrimental effect on that genre of the industry anyway, regardless of what the outcome is. Absolutely watch this space. Yeah, and it's just sad, I think, that we need so much case law to clarify the regulations, because as I mean, you've probably read the Housing and Planning Act. It's a thick old piece of
Yeah,
legislation. It's not like the Deregulation Act, which was kind of flung together just trying to tidy some stuff
we're
up.
section 33. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this was a thick old piece of legislation, and I think it's sad that it takes something to go all the way up to the highest court in the land to clarify what that actually means.
But because that shows, is that knowledge there to understand what it does mean? You imagine the Housing and Planning Act of 2016 was, they had a thing on there about abandonment, and it was very, it's an interesting thing, but it's kind of, that's a bit of an unknown entity, abandonment as well. I think have we done a talk on that one?
We haven't done abandonment. No, maybe that should be our next one, maybe
we should.
But I do agree with you. Abandonment is a huge grey area, because you've got to prove there is no intent to return. And how do you prove that? Even like the guy I was talking about earlier who's gone into prison. Yes, he's gone into prison for an awful long time.
He tends to go somewhere when he comes back, doesn't he?
Exactly. He hasn't at any particular time said, I promise I'm not coming back to that house. The offence didn't take place at the property, so there's nothing stopping him going back.
Yeah.
But how long does a landlord keep a property open, not receiving rent? Because obviously he's in prison, he's not working, he's not got an income.
And what about the belongings? How you don't want to breach the Interference with Goods Act. You've got all of these things that kind of. I mean, if anyone's watching this, Julie, they're thinking, why would you be a landlord? But it's. It is good when you do it properly and follow everything to the letter of the law. Yeah. It's quite poetic, especially if you have to go to court and then, all your fees are covered because you've got rent guarantee and legal cover. You get possession of the property back, you win, you get everything back. And it's kind of like, do you know what? It's always good to be able to ring a landlord and say, look, we're going to court with this tenant. But the great news is all the fees are covered. You've got rent guarantee, you've got legal cover, we've got this amount of cover. You're only going to, depending on how they return the property, that's the only thing you've got to really worry about. But then you've got buildings insurance. So it's much better, because so many landlords are like, I'm getting out. But the reality is it can work very well. And I'm not plugging my own business, but we look after about 160 properties, Julie, and none of them go to court. If we have issues, we deal with them quick. We have an audit log, we have a rent chasing system, we have a process from start to finish where we know what's going on and what we've served. So if we ever have to go to court, we can go, right, let's go exhibit A to Z. We've got everything, and it's really good. And if a tenant comes back, says, well, I mean, we've got a tenant at the moment, we're getting renewing the electrical report. She's at home because she doesn't want to let strangers in her property, which is fair enough. You've got the right of quiet enjoyment and exclusive possession and all that stuff. But don't ever go at the contractor when they have to turn the electrics off because they've got to do an electrical test. I mean, the world we live in is bizarre, and it's an education piece. Tenants don't really read the how to rent guide. People don't really read their contracts. And then when you go, actually, you look at that clause in the contract, because you've got to bring people's attention to stuff. But do we sit down with our clients and go, right, you're not leaving this room till you've read my contract? Well, they're never going to do it. They're never going to do it. So they have to read it in their own time. So you send a draft, you say, right, in 7 days, I'm going to send you the original contract. Once that's signed, we're going to go on the market. You're going to give me explicit legal instruction to proceed, because it's funny. We had a talk yesterday and one of the speakers said, we invest all of that time to go and meet a complete stranger, to go and value their house and give up all of our time and do all the comparables. We want something in return. But on the same token, if I was an agent, Julie, and you invited me out, I've got an hour to prove myself before you hand over the keys to your house with all your belongings and everything. It is that trust element. So the best thing to get out of this is probably do your due diligence and make sure you're covered for any legality. If anything goes wrong, what's your safety net? That's the big thing.
I think that's the key, isn't it? It's looking at it from day one as a business and treating it as a business. I think there's far too many landlords and agents alike that are people pleasers, and all they want to do is say yes, yes, yes all the time.
No problem, sir.
Yeah, no problem. I can do that. But then they've got no policies in place when it goes wrong. Like you've just spoken there about, a rent collection policy, what to do, from the day it's a day short, a penny late and a day short. You've got a process that even if you had a new staff member in the office today, they could pick up that policy and go, right, They're
I know
2
what to
days late
do.
with the rent. I know what to do. This is what I do. This is what I do when they're 5 days late, and whatever your policy says. But so many people don't have those in place, landlords and agents alike. And then they're fumbling around. At what point do they try and build up a relationship with the tenant? And it's a bit late once the tenant's 3, 4, 5 months in arrears to pick up the phone and go, why are you not paying your rent? You know, there's no clear-cut way of dealing with anything. And I think that's half of the problem. There's no process. And I always say, I akin it really to having children. Not that I have children, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But I think
I can help you.
I think tenants and landlords and agents to a degree are a little bit like toddlers, and they just need to be shown their boundaries.
Yeah, exactly.
Once they know where their boundaries are, they'll try and push them, but you just got to go, no, my policy and processes are this.
Exactly.
And that's how you've got to treat it, really. But it is surprising how many agents I speak to on a daily basis that do not have policies and procedures for anything. And it's frightening. And landlords, you know, self-managing landlords very rarely do, because they've been kind of bimbling along with the tenant. And I don't know how you feel, but I think WhatsApp is the worst thing that ever happened to the letting industry.
I hate it.
WhatsApp groups for HMOs, bad. Bad things happen on those WhatsApp groups. I had a landlord the other day tell me that he served Section 21 by WhatsApp. So that's valid, right?
Oh, of course it is. Yeah. No prescribed form or anything. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a screenshot of the Section 21, so that's fine. WhatsApp.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. Yeah.
It had 2 blue ticks on it, so the tenant got it.
They read it. Yeah, exactly. And then put LOL after.
Yeah. What's this?
Yeah. But, WhatsApp is.
I think WhatsApp's a big danger to the way that communication works with landlords, tenants, and agents. I just want it to go back to the professional way of just picking up the phone and speaking to someone. People seem frightened to talk to people nowadays.
Yeah, well, it's funny because we had this property management issue where with the drains, and we're trying to reach this landlord, and my property manager couldn't reach her. I said, I hate it, but WhatsApp him. Bang, he's come to life. Bang, 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 message, and it's just, he wasn't understanding what was going on, but he was responding, so he had it. And it's the work of the devil, it really is, because I've sent voice notes in the past to clients, and I've said things, and I think that could be taken out of context. You know, that could be taken out of context completely for the purpose of why I'm saying it. And it happens, you know, it is one of those things, but, you know, don't like it.
No, I agree with you. I had a similar situation where there was a WhatsApp conversation between a letting agent and a tenant, and she'd moved from one property to another. And one conversation that was used was about the deposit. So a deposit was paid on the first property. She was then paid that deposit back in full, but never paid a deposit on the new property. Of course, when she moved out of the new property, she went to a no-win, no-fee solicitor. They never protected my deposit, Gov. But used the WhatsApp from relating to the other property, talking about deposit and payment and everything. So there's proof that I paid a deposit, but it was for the other property, not this property that she'd had paid back. And of course, the solicitor isn't going to sit there and take the time to look at the date and the time on the WhatsApp compared to the tenancy agreement and anything like this. So unfortunately, it went to court, but thankfully the judge had enough coffee that day and just basically turned around to the no-win, no-fee solicitor and basically said, you should have known better.
Yeah.
Threw the case out, which
they don't, because they get the money, don't they? Oh no win, no fee. Of course, they don't get a penny then, do they?
No, so they have to push it to court because that's the only time they win. That's when they get their fee. But yeah, so we are coming up to that hour. Can you believe?
Can you believe we've been talking for an hour?
I know.
Will anyone watch that long, do you reckon? I feel like we've just been having a nice afternoon chat.
You never know. If they get to this point and comment, then we know that, absolutely.
We know that's
they've been watching up until this point.
This is it, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So going back to what our original topics were for today, which was permitted occupiers and subletting, I think the way I'd probably sum it up, and I'll ask you to do the same in a moment, is avoid at all costs, really, unless you can put something categorically in writing that is secure for both yourself as the landlord, yourself as the agent, and obviously protects the tenant. Because subletting, I can understand, because some people may be struggling to pay the rent. They're in a 2-bedroom property. It'd be great if they had a lodger to help pay the rent. I get it, absolutely. But you've got to look at where that leaves you as the tenant. HMOs, etc. We know that HMO licensing or HMO regs don't kick in if you're a living landlord until you've got 2 lodgers, so that's 3 people in the property. But at the same time, do you really want to push those boundaries? So for me, I would probably say sublet with a tight agreement in place, but avoid as much as you can. And the same with permitted occupiers. If the permitted occupier is going to go quietly at the end and you're guaranteed that, then do it. But then I think I agree with what you said, get them on as a tenant, because at least then you've got the security of being able to get rid of them.
Absolutely, 100%. Belt and braces.
Yeah, absolutely. So any final words for us, David?
Yeah, do it properly from the outset, set it up properly, get it all done. And when it goes wrong, don't try and fumble your way in the dark. Just get a solicitor and they'll know where to guide you. And it's worth their weight in gold. You'll spend a few £100s, could save you thousands. You know, you might rack up more debts, but you know, it's better to have that security blanket of the legal expert at the other end when it goes wrong, as well as the expert on the front end, to make sure, because you could have a legal expert on the other end and say, actually, because you didn't do it properly from the outset, you didn't serve the how to rent guide, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, we can't get you possession. And unfortunately, you've got yourself an assured tenancy. So unless the tenant, you can find another breach, you're stuck, really.
Yeah.
I've had to put a light on because it gets quite dark quickly now, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
I feel like I'm in a deep dungeon with it, looking at myself here.
Maybe you are. Maybe you
Maybe
are.
I am. Maybe I am. We'll never know.
Lovely. Well, I am going to bring our hour to a close then, David.
Okay.
So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll do it again soon.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
See ya.